Pull out your hose and grab your can. We're about to integrate another Pest Geek podcast. Hi, everybody. Frank Hernandez here, and welcome to the Pest Geek podcast, bringing you the latest information on pests, products, and politics from today's leading industry sources to help you start, manage, and grow your pest control business.
Thanks, Frank. Stepen Vantassel here, wildlife control consultant, bringing in another episode of Living the Wildlife. Today's topic is going to be on an interesting question, and that is, do pigeon droppings damage limestone buildings? You may say, well, of course they do. It's not quite that simple, at least as far as the researchers were concerned. Certainly, there is no doubt that pigeons, Columba livia, in terms of their scientific name, the common pigeon, the rock dove, when they damage buildings, certainly aesthetically, then in terms of how the building works. But what the researchers how the building looks, certainly everyone agrees that a building covered with bird excrement is just gross. And of course, we haven't even talked about any potential disease issues. And then, of course, the allergens are associated with bird droppings. But that is a topic for another podcast. This question is whether the bird droppings themselves, particularly those of pigeons, damage the limestone itself, like cracking it or etching it and degrading it at a chemical level. That has been the question. You may say, well, sure it will. Well, it's not quite that simple, because some researchers earlier believed that pigeon droppings actually had a minimal impact on limestone buildings. So why are we focusing on limestone? Well, the reason is a lot of historical buildings, particularly in Europe, were constructed where the facade of the building was created with limestone. Limestone has the ability of being easily carved, and it's gorgeous. If you've seen, if you've been to Europe, or even if you've been to the eastern part of the U.S., some of those buildings, some of those older structures in the heyday of America, in terms of where there was a lot of money flying around, where you had craftsmen who were able to carve these things. They would build these structures and then overlay them with limestone, and they would be beautiful. They'd be this gleaming white. And of course, if you ever go to a cemetery, the older cemeteries, you will notice a lot of limestone tombstones that are beginning to degrade over time. And this is when you talk about things like acid rain and perhaps smog. And so when you look at these structures over in Europe, the researchers believed that the pigeons, if they were doing anything, the damage was minimal. That the source of damaging chemicals could have come from the rain, like things like acid rain, or the pollution, or something else. Well, these researchers, and I'll give you their names here, because this study was done in Spain, so hopefully I'm pronouncing their names right. So the authors are Miguel Gomez Harris and David Benavente, Monica Alvarez de Borrego, and Rafael Fort. These individuals, these researchers, published an article entitled "Soluble Salt Minerals from Pigeon Droppings as Potential Contributors to the Decay of Stone-Based Cultural Heritage," published in the European Journal of Mineralogy, 2004, volume 16, pages 505 through 509. Now you may say, well, what is cultural heritage? Well, cultural heritage are if I'm understanding this correctly, are what we would call historic buildings. So when you look at the UN and has established various cities, a lot of them in Europe are called locations of cultural heritage. These are parts of the world that have historic architectural value, that they're just simply, you're not going to be able to reproduce that. These were things done in the past, and they're historic, and they're beautiful, and they took a lot of money to build. And so this was part of the reason when you look at these cultural heritage sites that when ISIS was in Syria and Western Iraq, they were destroying sites that were part of cultural heritage because they would be digging up archaeological sites and looting them and then blowing up various elements of these sites as well. So that was destroying cultural heritage. Well, these places in Europe are also called cultural heritage, and a lot of them are made or have facades of limestone, as I said, because it's easy to work with, and it's absolutely beautiful when it's created. All right, so let's kind of delve into this study a little bit more. What these individuals did is they went to a particular structure, I believe this was in Madrid, Spain, and they basically sampled pigeon droppings that had accumulations of almost a foot. And so that's where they took their sample. They were very careful to state that their sample came from a part of the droppings areas that were not exposed to rain. So these were probably covered areas where pigeons were just defecating for an extended period of time, obviously, that it got to a 12-inch area. And so they were careful to make their selections that included both dry and fresh droppings in their samples. And they collected enough because they basically wanted to perform two different tests. And I'm not going to bore you with a lot of the details of what they did with these tests, but basically what they were looking for was they wanted to know what kind of salts were present in the droppings. And then the second question they were looking to determine was what was the acidity of water that was then leached through those droppings. And so that was basically two different types of tests. And then they took that material and applied it to square samples of limestone to see if the pigeon droppings or the liquid had any effect on those limestone samples. So to make a long story short, they essentially found the following. That is that pigeon droppings had about a soluble salt content of about 4% by weight. Now, why does that matter? Well, what the authors claimed was that the salts that were contained inside the pigeon droppings had a reaction or had a physical effect to limestone that would ultimately crack and degrade the particles that are contained in limestone. So that coupled with the acidic element of the droppings, that you start getting etching in the limestone, and then the salts, the crystals in the salts, as they were forming, would then begin to break apart the particles within limestone. If you ever handle limestone, it has a gritty feel to it. When the sheen on it begins to degrade, because it's really kind of made of what do I want to call this? From crustaceans that have been sort of piled up and layered. And that's what limestone's made out of. It's made out of the exoskeletons of all these crustaceans that have been crushed. And so it's kind of an organic type material, even though we look at it as stone. It's made out of calcium and other elements that were involved in the exoskeletons of those various crustaceans. So what they found was, contrary to the results of other researchers, they did learn that pigeon droppings, when you have water mixing with that, is acidic. And the salts can degrade that material. So what does that mean for you as a wildlife control operator? When you were talking with a client who has a limestone facade, you should be able to let them know, saying, sir, understand that over time, as these droppings begin to accumulate and rain is mixing with them, this is going to degrade the facade of your structure at a faster rate than would ordinarily happen. So again, we don't want to use scare tactics. We don't want to hype things. Obviously, the degrading period, this takes time. Ultimately, everything decays over time. But when it comes to pigeon droppings, think of it as an accelerating factor that's going to increase the degradation on that building over time. And so the idea being, pay me now or pay someone else later. And of course, we don't have the kind of stonemasons available today that were available back 200, 300, 400 years ago, or even earlier, depending on the type of building that you're working on. So it is interesting to know that intuitively we would have thought that there was something going on here, but the research obviously demonstrated that they believe there is an effect here. And of course, they didn't wait. Obviously they're trying to get a publication out. So they couch their results in rather tentative May. In fact, let me kind of read how they phrase this. And they say, in conclusion, the conclusion here, the results of the study show that accumulations of pigeon droppings generate solutions with low pH and high salinity, that means high salt, when they are leached by water. The derived solutions contain significant concentrations of salts. This is contrary to the traditional view in which pigeon droppings are thought to have a limited impact on the decay of building stones, generating only phosphates and or nitrates on the surface. All of the salts identified in the leachates have been previously identified as possible decay agents on stone monuments and historical buildings. I'm skipping down a little bit. On the contrary, this paper confirms that pigeon droppings are a potential source of a wide range of salts and should therefore be considered not only in terms of the substantial visual disamenity, meaning the excrement looks terrible, they cause, but also as a possibly important factor in long-term decay of stone that could result from salt crystallization. Well, there you have it. So that is the scientific ease, the language there to just say, look, pigeon droppings degrade limestone. There you go. So if you ever need to prove that to a client, you have access to this particular publication and you can say, there you go, look it up. Kind of arcane, but again, I've been asked to be geeky. This is the Pest Geek Podcast, so these are things you're not ordinarily going to know on your own unless you're reading this type of literature, so that understand that intuitively you should realize that pigeon droppings are degrading limestone. Now you know that there's a scientific basis that says, yeah, they're degrading limestone, and maybe that'll help you tip that client over into selling that perhaps they do need to do a pigeon exclusion on that structure to help that building last longer. I'm Stepen Vantassel, wildlife control consultant, talking to you again about living the wildlife. Would love to hear from you, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to have your feedback. Thanks for listening. Back to you, Frank.
Thank you for listening to the Pest Geek Podcast. If you have enjoyed the Pest Geek Podcast, please give us a rating, write a review, or subscribe to the channel. You can join the Pest Geek Society by visiting pestgeekpodcast.com. Thank you for listening. See you next time.